The day of the verdict, there was a trillion things going through my mind before I got the verdict. It was like my life was flashed from year to year, going all the way back as far as I could remember. And all the names throughout the years were popping up in my head, and they were family members, negative and positive, friends that were negative and positive, managers that had stole millions from me, accountants and lawyers who had done the same. I thought about the people that had no reason but found a reason to hate me, along with all of my fans who really love and care about me. Then I thought about my kids, and I started wondering, what do little Rob, JJ, and Joanne think about me? And do they believe the things that they hear about me? Then I started asking myself, God forbid, if I'm found guilty, what would I do? Would I just fall to the ground? Would I just start yelling out about my innocence? Will I curse at the prosecutors? What would I do? That's what I kept asking myself. Because even though I know that I was being set up and railroaded, I didn't honestly know how I would react if the verdict was guilty. So in my mind, I began to tell God that I was going to trust his timing. And I told God that I'm going to trust his process. And when I said that, an unbelievable peace and calmness came over my entire body, my mind and my spirit. And suddenly, I heard the verdict. And as they continued to say, guilty, Your Honor, for some reason, every time they said, guilty, Your Honor, I spoke within my mask and I said, bless them, God. And the more I said that, the more I felt God's presence and his peace all over me. And it was the most strangest feeling I ever had experienced, simply because I wanted to scream, curse, and just belt out, I was set up. But God had spiritually injected me with a holy calmness. And as the marshals walked me out of the courtroom, as they would place me back in the handcuffs, one of the marshals asked me if I was okay. And right away, I said yes. I just have to get ready for an appeal. And the marshal said, good luck to me on my appeal. And he even told me how he'd seen lots of cases like this come back and win on appeal, which was encouraging to me. So I just immediately switched off the thought of the guilty verdict and started focusing my mind on God, positivity, and the appeal. And on the ride back to the MDC Brooklyn jail, the marshal that drove me was cool. He even asked me if it was a particular song I wanted to hear on the drive back. And I said yes. Sam Cooke, A Change Is Going to Come. And so he played it for me. And before you know it, we both were singing along with the song as it played. And my spirit was very positive as we were traveling back to the MDC Brooklyn jail. And so when we got back, we pulled into the back of the MDC Brooklyn jail and they took me out of the vehicle. And as I was still handcuffed, and they took me in to get stripped out, which means changed into my regular jumpsuit that I wear while I'm locked up at the MDC jail. So once I stripped out, things kind of felt different from when I normally returned from court, because they had me wait in a jail cell downstairs that had no seats or anything in it. And I was just standing there waiting, not really knowing what was going on. But then one of the officers came up and opened the cell and he gave me a chair. But as he was giving me the chair, a female doctor came in and got me, and her and the officers took me to the office. And the lady introduced herself to me as the psych doctor. She started asking me how I felt about the verdict. And I told her I felt bad about it. But at the same time, I told her I'm keeping a positive attitude because of my appeal that's coming up. And she told me that's good, that I was thinking positive, Then she asked me if I felt like I wanted to hurt anyone. And I said, absolutely not. Then she asked me if I had any thought of suicide or causing physical harm to myself. And I said, absolutely not. Then she asked me, give me a few reasons why you want to live. And I told her, for one, I'm afraid to die. And two, I'm engaged and about to get married. Three, I love my kids. And believe me, I'm going to be with them again. Four, I have family out in the world that loves me and is waiting on me to come home. I told her I have millions of fans around the world that love me and believe in me. And they are waiting on me. And they waiting for new music from me. And most of all, I believe in God and what the Bible says as far as suicide and how it's a sin. If someone was to commit suicide, there will be no way for them to repent for committing suicide, and they will go to hell. And I told the psych that I believe that. And I want to go to heaven. And she wrote everything I said on her notepad. She said to me, those are all great answers. And said that she felt good about everything I said and didn't think that I needed to be on suicide watch because she didn't feel like I was a threat to myself. But she did say the bad news was, as a precaution, they have to put me in the suicide room at least till the morning, just as a precaution. And she said, blame it on Epstein. Because he committed suicide, whenever someone gets a guilty verdict, as a precaution, they have to go into suicide watch for at least a day. And even though I knew that God's peace was on me and the furthest thing from my mind was the thought of suicide, I understood why for one night they wanted to place me under suicide watch. So I said, okay. And then I asked the psych doctor, it's just till tomorrow, right? And she said, yes, just until tomorrow. So they took me back upstairs to my unit, which was Unit K81, where I was originally, but instead of putting me back in my cell, they took me to a suicide room. When I first stepped into that suicide room, it just looked like and felt like death. It had a toilet with no cover, made out of steel, and it had a little sink with not much water coming out of it at all. And it was a hard mattress covered with plastic and no sheets. And the blanket that I was provided with fitted only half my body. And the worst of all, there was a surveillance camera up in the ceiling looking right down at the mattress and also the toilet, along with an officer sitting right outside the cell door, watching me and every move I make nonstop. I wanted out of there the very second they placed me in there. I didn't even care if I was going to only be in there till the next day. But soon as I got in that cell, another officer came in behind me and told me to take all of my clothes off, and he meant everything. But I refused to take off my boxes. So I took off everything except those. Then he gave me these thick smock to put. Then he gave me this thick smock to put on, and it was the most uncomfortable thing ever because it felt like it was not made for human beings. And I asked the officer, do they expect me to sleep in this? And the nurse said to me that it was just until the morning. So after they left and the cell door closed and locked, I had to use the bathroom so bad, but because of the camera being in the cell pointing straight at the toilet, mentally I just could not bring myself to using the toilet. So I decided to hold it until the next day. When you're on this kind of suicide watch, the officer told me that the psych said I was not allowed anything in my cell. No books, magazines, coffee, toothbrush, no shoes, pencil, pens, forks, spoons, or anything. And I just kept telling myself to just try to go to sleep so that I can make it to the morning because the psych doctor told me I would be coming out of there. Although I did lay down and threw that small piece of cover over my head, I never once went to sleep. But eventually, the morning came, and the head psych of the MDC Brooklyn jail came to my cell and told me that she read over my case and said that I should not be on suicide watch because I never showed any signs of suicide whatsoever. And I remember the officers was agreeing with her, and it made me feel a lot better because I'm just knowing that they are about to let me out. But then the head psych doctor said to me, although she don't think I should be in that suicide room or on suicide watch, the higher ups and the warden said to keep me in there. And I felt at that point like I was being punished because what else could I possibly think? After the head psych doctor gets overstepped by the warden, when the warden is not a doctor, why would they want to keep me in a place like this without my clothes, my shoes, and all my everyday hygiene, things that a human being needs to survive? Why? When she told me I had to stay there another night in that cell, I felt like my lungs started closing, and I immediately felt like my head and my brain was getting tighter and tighter by the seconds. As I continued to hear voices in my head saying, guilty, Your Honor, guilty, Your Honor, over and over again, everything in me was screaming and crying out for help. My body was shaking, but from the inside, I was cold all over my body, and I felt like I was going to stop breathing at any second. But I knew that I had to take all that I was feeling and not go crazy because they would have used that against me just to justify why I was placed in there in the first place. So I swallowed the moment again, thinking that the next day they were going to let me out of the suicide room. I tried to tell the psych doctor I would never think about killing myself. I started telling her about my 3 beautiful kids, who I miss so much. I told her that I was engaged to be married and how in love I am with my fiancée, Joy. I told her about my family and all my fans and how you guys are supporting me. And the psych doctor was upset because the warden went over her head and told him to keep me in the suicide room. But she said she will continue to fight for me to get me out of there. And then she left. And here I go again. Another night of staying awake. Another night of hearing voices in my head. Another night of having no towel, no soap, no toothbrush, or anything. And also another night of not being able to get up the nerve to go to the toilet and use it with that camera right over my head. So I decided to ask the officers that was watching me about the camera being on me and how mentally I could not pull my boxes down and sit on the toilet and boo-boo while I'm being watched. And the officer told me that the camera didn't work. But I did not believe that. But I told the officer that even if the camera didn't work, the fact that there's a camera in the cell pointing right at the toilet is mentally disturbing to the point that in my mind it feels like I'm being watched while I'm taking a dump. And that's invading my privacy. But nothing was done about it. But the next day came and I remember feeling excited because I felt like there's no way they're going to keep me in this place like this for 3 days straight. But when the doctor came, she asked me how I was doing. And I told her terrible. Then I explained to her how bad I had to use the restroom, but I could not do it because there's a camera pointing down from the ceiling onto the toilet. And when the psych doctor looked up in the ceiling of my cell, she was shocked to see the camera and said she didn't even know that there was a camera in the cell. Then she said she totally understands and is trying her best to get me out of the suicide watch, but for some reason the higher ups and the warden want me in there, and I just started bawling and getting upset. I started complaining about nightmares, about not having a shower, not being able to call my family, and not being able to brush my teeth, and how cold and hungry I was, and how I have not slept in 3 days, and how I have to go to the bathroom really, really, really bad. And at that point, none of my complaints had done me any good. So I ended up spending another night in the suicide room. And the next day I had a legal call with my lawyer. And I explained to my lawyer where they put me after the verdict and what I had been going through while being there. And all of my lawyers seemed furious, to the point that they called the MDC Brooklyn jail to try to get me out of the suicide room. But once I got off the phone with my lawyers, they put me right back in the suicide room. And it took everything in me not to collapse, because I felt so weak in my legs. And that's because I felt like my brain was starting to shut off, because I was so exhausted and overwhelmed by being in that suicide room. And now they putting me right back in there again after 4 days of being in the suicide room. The nightmares that I was having started turning into daymares. And it scared me, because once it turned into daymares, I kept catching myself drifting off into everything that had happened to me since my arrest going 2.5 years back. And because it was so quiet in that cell, it felt like time had just stopped. I would especially think about the brutal assault that I experienced while I was asleep. And it just felt like it was happening while I was awake, but I couldn't figure out if I was really awake or if I was dreaming that I was awake. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, because I really don't know if I do. But after 4 days in the suicide room, they finally came and took me to get a shower. And it felt like I was getting ready to come out the suicide room. But after the shower, they took me right back to the suicide room, where I had to stay another night. At some point, they gave me a 15-minute phone call. But after that, it was right back to the suicide room. And every time I saw the psych doctor, I would let them know about the experience I was having. I would also tell them that I really needed to use the restroom and how I've been holding it in my stomach for 4 days now. And it felt nauseous, and I felt nauseous, but they still did nothing. But when I had another legal visit, I went downstairs to talk to my lawyers, and the officers downstairs allowed me to use their bathroom down there. After my visit with my lawyers, they took me right back to the suicide room, and I was able to get a couple of pencils, a pen, a couple of magazines, and some extra food. But I had been in that room for 4 or 5 days, and my brain was completely shut down, that nothing mattered. So at that point, I had to act like a normal person, because I needed to come out of there. And if I would have broken down, I knew I would be in there longer. So all of the other inmates started arguing with the officers and the psych doctors, telling them how I should not be in the suicide room and to let me out of there. But those officers and the psych doctors agreed with the inmates. They just kept telling them it's over their heads. Then eventually, 6 or 7 days later, one of the psych doctors came to the suicide room and told me that they were going to release me on one condition, and that was I had to check in with the officers every 2 hours and show them a red card that said I was a high accountability inmate. I had to show this card to the officers every 2 hours from 8 o'clock in the morning all the way to 8 o'clock at night. They told me that if I missed showing them, I would be put right back in the suicide room, which brought me on another level of anxiety and pressure. And I told the psych doctor, by me having to show this red card to the officers every 2 hours from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, so that they see that I haven't committed suicide, actually reminds me of suicide. Every 2 hours from all day to all night. And I did not want to even be thinking about anything like that every 2 hours throughout the day. I also said to the psych doctor that even if someone was planning on doing something to themselves, after they show the officers that red card, they have a whole 2 hours to do whatever they want to do to themselves. But they still made me do it to check in with the red card, and I'm still doing it to this very day. And I cannot describe how stressful it has been for me to have to do that.
We here now. Damn, I wish I was pushing the Damn, I wish I was pushing the act. Damn, I wish I was pushing the act. I had no haps if I was pushing the act. Damn. 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 I wish I was